what exactly are interpersonal relationships and how do they impact women's mental health?
Okay. So when we look at interpersonal relationships, see, none of us grow up in a vacuum. We all grow up in a society. We have our childhood where our family takes care of us. We have people whom we are continuously interacting with. I think human being is the only species who is dependent on external care up for the first year of life. So interpersonal relationship is a very integral part of the way who we are. We are social animals. Okay. So when we talk about mental health and interpersonal relationship, it's a kind of bi-directional relationship where the way we have had our early relationships. Because what is a relationship? It's basically a bond. It's a reciprocal kind of an engagement between two people. I may have a relationship with my computer as well. Okay. But if you look at it, the component of relationship is that it's an emotional bond. I'm attached to my computer. I may at times talk to it in frustration, or I may say, what the hell are you doing here? Why aren't you working right? So when you look at the concept of relationship, it's basically a very dynamic and alive process. Okay. So when we talk about this in the context of mental health and specifically women's mental health, uh, gender comes into play in our lives right from maybe 3 4 years of age, where we become aware of our own bodies. We become aware that we are termed as a girl, we are termed as a boy, or also we as we grow older, we understand about sexual orientation. And in all of this, there are a lot of societal attitudes that revolve around this. Some of these attitudes are positive, encouraging, some of these attitudes are negative and become obstacles for our self expression. So when we look at women, there definitely are a lot of differences between men and women's ability to communicate, their emotional expression, how they experience their lives as a result of the social context. Okay, not just inherently as a as a XX and XY chromosome, not just as a genetic context, but as a social context. So women, given the kind of society that we live in, are more susceptible, I would say. I know it's a strong statement that I'm making, but definitely many research studies show that women are at a greater risk and likelihood to experience disturbances, emotional disturbances compared to men. So much of their emotional or mental health distress is in the context of interpersonal connections. It's not just so. If I look at, say, for example, a diagnosis like schizophrenia, definitely it is has a genetic basis, a hereditary basis, but the way schizophrenia experience for a woman would play out in her house and the way it would play out for a man in the house are different. And that is where the social expectations and the attitudes come into play. So I do think yes, it is an important point to look at when we are working with women and their mental health.
Right. Definitely. So I think that's an important aspect to start off with, that the way, mental health conditions play when, for a woman versus a man
Yeah.
is different. So setting, that straight, I think then let's move on to understand that how does one, determine, how can one determine if the mental health problem that one is facing is interpersonal in nature?
See, any mental health, when we talk about mental health, uh, I would look at it in the form of a continuum. Okay, it can range from the unpleasant negative thoughts, positive thoughts that we have about ourselves. Meaning, let's start from the positive end of the spectrum and move on to the negative. So the positive could be healthy attitudes, healthy self concept, healthy self esteem, not over not not being ego inflated, knowing one's boundaries, knowing what one can do, what one needs more help with, knowing one's strength. So from that on the spectrum, we then move on to having mild difficulties in the relationships, and then we give ourselves explanations about what is the reason for these relationship difficulties. Is it something that I did, or is it something that the other person is doing to me? And it can be something which can be resolved by talking, communicating, negotiating, then moves on to a slightly more problematic mental, what health issues. So I would say positive to problems, minor problems to mental health issues, when we will call it. And that's a little more intense in terms of the distress and the disturbance, the stress we may experience, the tension we may experience, the anxiety we may experience, the nervousness that may happen before any kind of, for example, a child who is, or a person who has to face an interview or has to do some performance, then that that initial few moments before, I'm sure you also would have experienced just before we start the webinar, oh, it's time to start, and that there is an activation in the body. Now that activation, when I begin to look at it negatively, becomes a problem for me. Till the time I name it as an excitement, it is fun, it's good, I feel energetic. But the moment I start naming it in terms of, my confidence or my self-esteem, or will I be able to, perform as much as I thought? So the issue part of it becomes much more intense. And then you have mental illness and disorders, okay, which is the much more, what one would say, much more severe kind of mental thought processes and emotional dysfunctions that disrupts your function. So when you're asking me the question about how can we find out whether my mental health condition, I'm assuming the mental health disordered or illness phase that I'm experiencing, is it because of interpersonal challenges or is it a consequence? One thing we need to understand is when we talk about mental health, what is mental health? Mental health is defining the way I think, the way I feel, and therefore the way I behave, and then what interpretations I make of what is happening around me and what people are doing, and etc. So it's all about thinking, perception, emotions, the intensity. And what happens is when I am in that phase of mental disorder, not just mental health issue, but along, the kind of slide back starts from mental health issue. From there onwards, the way I would relate to others changes. So it is very difficult to say whether interpersonal problems के वजह से mental health issues आए हैं या mental health concerns डेवलप होने की वजह से interpersonality में ज्यादा, interpersonal relations में problems आ रहे हैं. Okay, one good thing way to look at it is that when there are difficulties that I begin to experience in any relationship, whether it's my family, my spouse, or with my children, or at my workplace, we need to look at how it is affecting us. Say, mera boss ne mujhe, he's probably, shouted at me for something, maybe something that I have not done according to his or her expectation, and they have kind of publicly, censured me. How does it affect compared to if they are calling me into their cabin and saying this is not expected and you go and correct this in this manner? Okay, so any of these circumstances are going to affect our perceptions. So we need to be aware of our perceptions. If we don't be aware of our perceptions, if we don't be aware of how these experiences are affecting us, and we kind of give explanations to our own selves, which we don't test out with someone else, then we are likely to interpret those experiences in a negative manner and believe it to be true. Which, if I begin to believe it to be true, then it's going to affect the way I connect the next time with that person or in that context, which will further lead to negative experiences, and that's where it becomes more of a problem. Okay, so where we do see that the interpersonal context of the individual. When the person finally arrives at the counselor's cabin or at a doctor's clinic or is sharing with a friend, very close friend, the first thing that other person would do is, how did it all start? Okay, and where we see that there have been interpersonal difficulties. Okay, the examination needs, prior to it blowing up to this level, we need to begin to look at how the person's maybe thinking process, whether it is, whether there is any kind of hereditary risk, or which has, the family history, if there is any risk of mental health issues, or is it the context which has created a particular perception in the person's mind. If it is a context which has created the perception in the person's mind, then we need to work with changing that. So, all in all, what I'm saying is, you can't really talk about a separate set of, yes, definitely, if a person has undergone a lot of stress, trauma, life, events like grief, death, loss of a loved one, or unemployment, or even now what we are experiencing in terms of social distancing, not being able to connect, are going to affect our mental well-being. But when we look at it from the context of mental disorders, it is also possible that my mental health, poor mental health condition is contributing to the interpersonal difficulties. In all, that's what I'm actually saying.
Got it, got it. So I think then the key is not to fall into the pattern of validating the responses, but rather seeking professional help, or at least seeking another opinion.
Exactly, very important. And with this kind of social, if you look at society now and compared to the earlier times, social support networks, emotional bond with people was, you didn't have to put in special effort. It was all part of our growing up. Whether it is with your extended relatives or your cousins. Now there is so much of isolation. We are all living in our own bubble, and we are creating a reality, and we believe that reality, and many times we don't check whether that reality is correct or incorrect. So it really contributes to this entire, and that is the reason why I feel that, uh, with so much of materialism coming in. I know I may sound a little like a dinosaur of when I say materialism versus, you know connectedness. Agar hum dekhenge, connectedness, do we really feel connected with our own self and outside? Examining that is very important, because interpersonal is not just about relationship, is not just about me and the other. Relationship is also about me and myself, the self talk that I give. And that's where I think we as a society, we are beginning to understand that examining that is very important. And that's why you find currently in psychology field so many mindfulness practices, which are being understood, researched, because finally it's about spiritual connection with your own self. So, I would kind of put that as a broader context within which the interpersonal life of a person is playing out.
Right, right. And I think with the lockdown, then there's also the aspect about how external social factors have drastically reduced, and there is this opportunity of connecting, with
Yes.
ourselves, as you mentioned, mindfulness sessions, and definitely this time is something that we must utilize, because I'm sure it's going to be hard to, come across uh, such an experience again. Great. I think then let's move on to the next question at this point, which is about understanding. Um, do you think that the patterns of psychological distress and psychiatric disorders among women are different? So they play differently in women versus in men?
Hmm. Definitely, yes. Definitely, yes. In fact, there's a lot of research which has been done, which shows that when we look at disorders like, say, depression, anxiety, more of the, neurosis conditions, um, substance use, definitely there is a difference where women are at a greater risk In fact, some research shows that I could just read out a couple of statistics. This was a research done by Savita Malhotra and her colleague in 2015. It's a published research in the Indian Journal of Psychology. When we look at anxiety, depression, and in general psychological distress, women are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience these conditions compared to men. Somewhere men seem to have uh, see, if I were to ask you, or if I were to ask us to look at what is that main thing which differentiates a woman's experience in our society as it is, I'm not talking only about urban, I'm talking about in general. Keep India as an entire country in your mind, not just Mumbai city, or Bangalore or Delhi, where it's a prime kind of cosmopolitan environment and all, with education. If you look at overall India, men definitely seem to have a higher, more superior, platform that they are in. They seem to have more sponging around them, sponge around them, bubble wrapping them from the stresses. And it's the women who kind of plod on and plod on and plod on. So, given plod on meaning, they are taking more responsibility. They have to, live up to the expectations of the family. If a man does not live up to the expectations of the family, oh, you kind of, there is an acceptance. But for women, that is not. They have to live up to that. Otherwise, they face lot of consequences. Taking a very simple example, if you have an alcoholic husband, okay, it's very easily accepted that mard hai wo to peene hi wala hai, there's no point trying to deal with him, let me begin to look after my life and my children, and still try to cater to his needs and get beaten up and stuff. But think about a situation where the woman is alcoholic. Do you think that will happen? That is not going to happen. The acceptance for a woman having substance abuse problem is not there. So she faces a greater, what you can call, greater stressful, it's a greater stressful experience for her. And there are much more hardships that she would have to face.
Yeah.
So this social context plays out in a manner that women are more likely to show certain kinds of conditions. Okay. Another thing is also research shows women tend to deal with these, because the context what we are talking is in interpersonal. Women tend to deal with these interpersonal difficulties by internalizing it than externalizing it. I tend to feel more guilty. I tend to think that I am not good enough. I tend to think that I'm not a good daughter. I'm not a good sister. I'm not a good mother. Okay. And whereas men are probably growing up in such a manner, or they've grown up in such a manner that it's easy for them to externalize it कि उसके वजह से ये हुआ है. There is that divide, meaning it may be a topic for debate. I'm sure there might be some people who say no, but I personally feel that this divide is there, and that is the reason why women are more likely to show higher prevalence of certain kinds of conditions. Even when we look at substance abuse, if you look at say any of these addictions, women are more likely to become substance addicts compared to men, and that's a biological reality. Meaning there are some research which does show that our bodies, women's bodies, are made in such a manner that they are more likely to develop dependence, chemical dependence, compared to men. So that biological risk plus the social context definitely sets the ground for a different pattern of prevalence in these psychiatric conditions. And they are less likely to receive help. Meaning, just off the topic, I don't want to take too much of your time with this question, but there was a time, I think, first 5 years of my career in the beginning, I had volunteered for this project as a rapporteur for workshops that were happening for tuberculosis health workers who had to go in. It was a government project, and these health workers were getting trained in that dot system of how to go into families, tell them, identify if they do have patients, and then send them to the healthcare center, because free medication for tuberculosis was available. So this, I'm talking about a physical condition. Women in the household who may have physical health conditions which are treatable, And what emerged in that workshop with many of the health workers saying is that the families were unwilling to send their women to the health hospital to take medication. अगर हम उसको भेजेंगे तो घर पे काम कौन करेगा, बच्चों को संभालेगा कौन, उसको तो सुबह उठ के, क्योंकि वो टाइम पे जाना होता है, ओपीडी का टाइम जो भी होगा, सो दे वुड से कि अगर वो उस समय जाएगी तो घर में नाश्ता नहीं बनेगा, उसको तो काम पे जाने का है, उसका मर्द को तो. सो व्हेन फॉर अ फिजिकल कंडीशन दिस काइंड ऑफ you know uh, uh,
Attitude.
blockage there is, attitude there is, imagine for a mental health. As it is in India, we don't think mental health is a separate thing. It's only now that conversations in the last 5 to 8 years that we are talking about it. So these differences play out because of our biological difference. They play out because of the social circumstances, and they also play out because how health service access is available for women.
That is true. I think you've rightly pointed out that uh, although we are, here today having a conversation around mental health, but looking at it from a broader perspective, and look, if we have to consider India as a whole, not just these, not looking at the situation in metro cities alone, we still have a long way to go. And
Yes,
definitely women, I think, as somebody also mentioned in the chat section, and when it comes to the roles and responsibilities for women, the challenges, the expectations are entirely different from men. So hence the way it impacts their mental health also varies great to a great
definitely.
extent.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Right. So, then talking about understanding how to overcome these challenges, my next question to you is about how do you think interpersonal therapy works with mental health patients looking at the Indian scenario?
So before we talk about interpersonal therapy, because interpersonal therapy would mean it's a specific approach to looking at uh, treatment or looking at working with clients who have mental health issues, just like any other therapy. Like you have CBT, you have REBT, so you have family systems theory, you have EMDR. So looking at these various approaches, all of them definitely are aimed towards improving, first identifying and improving the uh, mental would translate into the thoughts and the emotional life of people. See, because any kind of issue that we are having outside, the issue is not outside, the issue is in the way we are looking at it. If we change the way we look at things, then the same situation can be dealt with more positively. Okay, so all therapies, when we look at it, would bring about change in the person such that his interpersonal relationships become much more healthier and much more satisfying. Also, be enabled or empowered to take decisions when you need to leave relationships which are harming you. Okay, specifically coming to interpersonal therapy, that approach looks at, meaning the question, I don't know how many of us therapists specifically would use any one approach. I think whenever we deal with clients, it's more of an eclectic approach that we use because nobody fits the book. This approach, the view about human nature, the techniques and the tools that are looked at, and what you're going to change, whether it's a thought you're changing or the intensity of emotion you're changing, or is it through a behavioral reward and reward contingencies you're changing, are all specific techniques so that the book gives. But when I talk to you as a client, you're a live person. You're not going to be by the book. You're going to be by your book. So all of us would definitely use a more eclectic approach uh, in terms of understanding what the problem is and what I need to target, what should be the goal, and how to bring about that change. So this has to be, whichever approach we use has to be in the context of that person. We don't try to fit the client to the book. We try to fit the technique for the client. Okay, that's one. Second thing is specifically interpersonal therapy focuses on the nature of relationships of people, meaning of the, say a woman is coming up to a counselor for help. Ki, I don't know, I'm just kind of very dissatisfied these days. I feel I'm not doing well and I'm losing my confidence and I'm feeling depressed most of the time. You know, I have children, I need to look after them, but I just don't feel like doing anything. You know, a woman comes up and says this. If I were an interpersonal therapist, I would look at what is the context she's talking about. So I'll ask her a few questions about the context, elaborate on the problems that she experiences, look at the nature of relationships she has, look at the communication style that's there, not only her, but in the family itself. Or if she talks about it in the workplace, then look at also what is the communication pattern in the workplace, what is the emotional atmosphere like in that relationship context. Okay, and I will take all this information and also make an assessment of what are her challenges specifically in these, for these identified context. Okay, and then one would look at assessing her own style of coping with these, and putting it forth to her in the form of hypothesis as to how these issues could be changed, how these issues could be worked through. And then I would have a working through phase in the therapy where we are actually probably using a role play, or maybe we are examining that context much more to find out if there is a irrational expectation that I'm having, or is it a boundary issue of that I can't say no. So identify all these and then look at giving adequate practice and confidence to encouragement to practice this in real life, take the feedback and then work. So interpersonal therapy will look at primarily the relationships in the different social context and uh, of the person, and try to identify not just at an individual level but also at a systemic level, and how it is impacting. The change will happen by the person. He may not be able to change the family's communication pattern, but I can begin to wear I can begin to bubble wrap myself and keep away the negative shots that are coming towards me. That kind of empowerment one would work it. So it's also a time limited thing. It doesn't go in like psychoanalysis where you go into your deep down secrets of your past and unconscious, uncovering unconscious. No, it doesn't really look at unconscious. It talks about how things are playing out. Like right now I'm talking, okay, so I can see your expression. So how am I interpreting your expressions? Maybe some people are putting certain things on the chat. If I look at the chat, I can look at how is my behavior impacting. So it's the present, here and now, kya ho raha hai, uske upar humko kaam karna hai. So it also becomes time limited and very focused. That's how one would use interpersonal therapy in treatment.
Got it. I have a question from one of the participants, which is about they're asking, how does one assess a good interpersonal relationship? Are there any, assessment tools or psychological tests to un-
Uh, um, Whether the relationship is good or no, I think the yardstick that one would use is there first and foremost, is there a connect that I feel? One, okay. I'll probably give a more colloquial, generalized answer, and then we will look at a context of, you know, this. Look at one context of this question. So, in general, I would say any good relationship is where there is respect. Reciprocity for me comes second, but inherently there is respect, there is reciprocity, there is also a kind of emotional connect that I would feel. The experiences that are part of that relationship would be positive, healthy, not demeaning in any way, not it's not that I'm compromising all the time or I'm submitting all the time. There is no domination. There is an it is a relationship of equal. Okay, so in general this is what I would look at, and this question also comes to me many times when my students kind of, they come up ki ma'am aise hua, usne aise bola, mujhe waise bola. So the conversation with my student goes around examining these. Okay, many times we get into relationships because we are looking for something that we think we don't have. We try to, we are trying to complete ourselves, and that's not a very healthy thing. Meaning, I'm complete by myself. Having been complete, I'm establishing a relationship with Pardi. Kind of, it's not that Pardi is completing my life. Yes, it's a joy to be together, but I can still exist. I do exist valuably in the absence of the other person. That's one. In the context of mental health, specifically, if we talk about mental disorders uh, or mental illnesses, good relationship. I, uh, I would so if say someone is coming to me saying that I've been going around with this person for so many months or so many, maybe a few years, and initially the relationship was like this, and now I suddenly find him or her becoming too suspicious and is all the time trying to impose things on me. I am beginning to feel that kind of घुटन, मुझे घुटन हो रही है. So the conversation will not just remain at the level of whether what I told earlier, respect, equality. I will want to find out, is there some problem with in terms of personality. In such an issue case, I would want to use maybe tools to assess the personality, if to identify if there are certain patterns which kind of uh, I can't use the word presuppose, but which set the ground for difficulties or unhealthy relationships. So if I know that the person has a narcissistic kind of a profile, it's going to cause difficulties if I'm his or her partner. So these are the two contexts that I would like to divide it into.
Right.
I hope I answered the question.
No, yes, I think
No specific tool, but you need to know why you want to assess.
got it. I think yes, no, we have you know, we have a good enough understanding of how to approach it. So I think that should definitely set the context there. We have another interesting question from one of the participants, which is what if a person is surrounded by a traumatic family environment, and but given the scenario they can't really go anywhere, so how can they deal with it given that there is no personal space as well?
I know this is a huge difficulty. Like I'll tell you, just with that participant, we have started with our online lectures, and many of our students come from backgrounds, maybe the socio-economic background is not very healthy, is not really, and we need to have the videos on because attendance ye wo वगैरह, and many of them say that ma'am, I can't keep my video on because पीछे आप पता नहीं क्या क्या चल रहा है. And some cases we have seen where we insist that no, आपको audio तो आपको on करना पड़ेगा, because I pointedly asked a question at you and I need to know whether you're listening or not. And the moment the student switches on the audio, background में TV चालू है and she's studying there. So this circumstance that is there, is a reality of many people's lives. So I understand the question in terms of there may be the household in which one is growing up, or the family environment is not very conducive. What to do about it? First, acknowledge that it's not your fault. Okay, that you are in this kind of a circumstance, it's not your fault. Second, seek help. In fact, I was talking to the organizers, Pallav and Kushbu also, and I have given them a couple of numbers, which probably if you could put out on the chat box, uh, for people to seek help. These are all helpline numbers, and these are at least the three of them that I have put forth, I have verified them and they are in working condition, because many times helpline number pata chalta hai lekin wo koi uthata nahi hai phone. So these are verified. One of them is Tata Institute, the other is a Samaritan's helpline for emotional distress, and it's a suicide prevention helpline. And also Sneha, another NGO which is working in the field of domestic violence abuse. So seek help. First, don't blame yourself. To know that it is a problem, to seek help. You can't deal with the problem by yourself. You need external support. The external support may not be taking you out of that situation, but the external support may be in the manner where you get to talk about what's happening with you and you know that you're not alone. Okay. And as you probably, when you reach out, you will also be able to identify how you can protect yourself. So I'll just narrate a case study. This is my colleague in my college. She also is a practitioner, and in her practice, she came across. No, I think it was one of the students who kind of, because we have papers like counseling, psychology, developmental, and all that. So students also come up with their own, issues that they face, and they try to talk to their teachers to find out. So one of the student was getting sexually violated in her own house by her family member. And this is not during the lockdown period. In fact, if you look at the current news, definitely domestic violence and all these violations have increased, because and they can't seek much help outside. They can't really run out of the house. Okay. So when she was working with the student, कि कुछ कर तो नहीं सकते हैं, क्योंकि मम्मी भी I think a male family member was abusing her, molesting her regularly, and the mother was kind of helpless. The mother herself, see, this is where women we talk about are not empowered enough to take stands in such situations. So she kind of colluded with the male member and she said, नहीं नहीं, ignore it, कुछ नहीं है, ठीक हो जाएगा, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है, उनका मतलब ऐसा नहीं होगा. And the child, the girl, teenager felt completely confused कि क्या चल रहा है, मुझे तो लग रहा है ये गलत है, लेकिन मेरे सपोर्ट सिस्टम मुझे बोल रही है कि मैं गलत हूँ. So with all that confusion, when she spoke to her teacher, my colleague simply advised her कि identify what all you can do. मतलब जब भी कोई ऐसे मतलब the person is drunk and coming in, either if you can move out of that room, okay, or scream. I know we will wonder, kya advice is scream, but when you make noise, one, the perpetrator, I'm specifically talking in the context of violence and perpetration of sexual violence, the perpetrator, definitely you're gathering attention. This behavior is not going to happen in the secrecy. Or if you do have access to another room, go there, close the door. Okay, so these are some practical things that one needs to evolve in the context where the household itself, there is a lot of trauma playing out and violence playing out.
Right.
That's one way I would answer that question.
And I think there can be then another way to look at it, right? What if in the case of, I would say, mental torture? I mean, not just limited to.
Yeah, so where it is not these kind of extreme events, but the regular nagging and the regular do this and do that and don't do this and I don't like the look of your face and why are you standing here and all these kind of unhealthy communication that happens. One is it signifies that there definitely is a problem in the relationship, which have got escalated in this period of lockdown, because you can't really ignore, and I can't stay at my office till 9 o'clock and then just come back for dinner at home and go to sleep. I am with that person. So what we do, or what we generally suggest, is that in such situations uh, we need to develop a new pattern of communication where we probably if it's in the relationship between, say, I'm taking the example of, say, a spouse, between spouses, then you fix a kind of time where you really are going to talk about what each one of is feeling, and have the remaining part of the day, have a designated time, and the remaining part of the day, there is going to be no conversation around that kind of issue. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Now, for this to be successful, both the parties have to engage. एक पार्टी में मैं बोल रही हूँ मेरे हस्बैंड को कि नहीं, हम सिर्फ सुबह ही बात करेंगे, इसके बाद जो भी होगा हम इसके बारे में नहीं, कल सुबह वापस इसके बारे में बात करेंगे. ओके, बट माय हस्बैंड इज नॉट विलिंग टू एडमिट इट, सो ही हिज बिहेवियर कंटिन्यूज. आई हैव टू डेवलप boundary within my own self. See, we all have a mental life. My relationship with you is actually influenced not exactly by what you do, but what I think you're doing. Okay. So when are you getting what I'm saying, Pardi? You're looking at the time. Maybe I'm in the teacher's role right now. So what I need to do is I need to take care of my mental life. And if I find that thinking about what you're saying is hurting me, then I need to put a barrier for myself and distance emotionally myself from the context. I may not be able to physically distance, but emotionally I may need to distance. But if that becomes a continuous pattern of emotional distancing, we also think that, oh, emotional distance, matlab aap emotionally connected nahi ho. There is a premium of being emotionally connected. But that emotional connection is becoming unhealthy for me. So I need to be aware and I need to create that. And then I need to look after myself. That even if that person makes these kind of comments, I am not going to respond to them. I'm going to respond to them. I'm not going to react to them.
Right.
So when I draw that emotional boundary for myself, for the time being, my welfare is taken care of.
Right.
Changing that person is not in my hand, but changing how I deal with it is in my hand.
That's true. Responding but not reacting, I think, is the
Yes.
key here. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. I think we have a couple of questions that have, come our way in the
There is
meantime.
one question. Abuse often leads to denial. How help can be given to a person who is in denial? It's an important question, so I'll just probably maybe take a minute. Yes, abuse denial is very much part of, like I'll tell you, many of us, meaning this is my own personal story. I don't feel any shame about it anymore. I don't hold myself responsible for it. And therefore, I'm able to talk about it openly. And I think this is very important in breaking denial. When I was a child, I had a very close family. He's not a family member. He was a very close friend of the family. And almost like, meaning he's known me right from 3 years of age. And it was almost like, my uncle, meaning my dad's brother. That was the mental framework that I thought. And when I grew up and I started showing pubertal changes, he started touching me in ways which I used to feel uncomfortable. But because I come from a very social, conservative atmosphere, I could not really address it. Meaning, my mom's response to such, violations was about, no, you have to be careful. You have to. You're a girl. Don't go there. It was more of restricting me rather than helping me to learn stand up and fight that person. Okay, so that's the environment. So for a very long time, I was confused about what had happened to me, and I did, to some extent, because as I grow older, obviously news, media, conversations with friends, I know that this was some hanky panky that was going on, and it was not right. And I had to explain it to myself, and I probably thought maybe I was a reason. Meaning, being a girl, I am going to be susceptible to such advances of men, and it is my job to protect myself, and I can't bring about a change. I became aware that this was sexual abuse only when I became an adult. Till my entire the childhood and my adolescent period, I was not aware that this act that happened with me was molestation. I just was confused कि ये normal है क्या है. So imagine the denial. Okay, मतलब lack of awareness के वजह से denial. Now that I'm talking openly about it, what is required for me to feel the courage, because I got so much of support when I started sharing it. That support helped me to accept that something like this has happened to me. How many of the participants here, we are sitting here, if I were to be able to ask for a show of hands, how many of us would be able to talk about it? Okay, one way to break the denial is to talk about it. But specifically, if I get a client where I suspect that something like this has happened, because this is also a webinar on mental health, okay, and I'm taking the context of mental illnesses and disorders. So, trauma, that's part of many of our lives. If I get a client who is having a history of such, violence or abuse, but is unwilling to share about it, or is belittling it, nahi nahi utna nahi mara usne, thoda hi mara, utna nahi kiya. This is all part of denial. I'm not going to sit here and make her accept that this is what has happened to her. See, her denial is there for a purpose. The purpose is for self protection, emotional self protection. Okay, and she doesn't feel empowered enough. So I would work with her, or him also. These days it's also a him in that context. I would work to build, empower them in terms of their self concept. I will first build their emotional strength, and then probably work with going back to that history of how it is. So, when you're dealing with a client of abuse, uh, we can't go with this thing about, oh, now I will go and complain to the police and I'll do this. We need to really first work on the safety of the person, create a safe environment. If you have the safe environment, then you can help to poke holes in the denial. Otherwise, you're opening up a Pandora's box where you may not actually be able to help the person, and the safety is compromised. So we need to be very sensitive around it. And to, as mental health professionals, because this is a webinar that's attended also by students, that's what I hear, I want to pass on this message that working with trauma of any sort, working with sexual violence victims, working with domestic violence and abuse victims is a specialized area. So the regular training that we get, as part of our coursework, may be insufficient in terms of equipping us. So we need to intern under someone or work with an NGO which works in these areas to build our skills as professionals. Okay, and then and only then we would be able to provide a healthy service for our clients. Yeah. So I've taken that question. Sorry, it was out of turn.
No, that's completely fine. I think
Yeah.
you've set the path, which I think is important, because there's definitely confusion on how to approach. So getting guidance there is definitely important. I have, since we're also kind of running towards our end time, I have another interesting question from one of the participants, which is uh, more like a the connection. I mean, how we cannot look at interpersonal relationships in isolation, but how other factors also influence it. So the question is that since women are defined, no, since women define themselves by their interpersonal relationships, so failing here and possibly economic problems or dependence then can keep the woman trapped and basically unable to see, make them yeah, take away the access to help. So how can they deal with this?
Yes, this definitely is a social reality. And until and unless the social reality changes, difficulty for women who are dependent financially is going to happen. I think what I would say is See, at a personal level, acknowledge to yourself the, that okay, there are issues, I need help. Okay. And look at the situation as a problem solving situation than an insurmountable situation. See, I would like to give the analogy of trekking. Okay, when we begin a trek, okay, the low slope low hota hai, financial condition अच्छी है, ज़्यादा problems नहीं है, those kind of things. So low level पे आपको उतना तकलीफ नहीं होने वाला है. आप mid point reach करते हो, अगर आप ऊपर देखोगे, अरे बाप रे, उतना ऊपर और जाना है, तो आपकी हाफ एनर्जी उधर ही डाउन हो जाएगी. अगर आप नीचे देखोगे और देखोगे कि अरे इतना ऊपर मैंने आ गई 1.5 घंटे में, वाओ, then you get motivated to go further. Okay, so it is difficult, no doubt, because access to healthcare is an issue for women even today. Even today, access to healthcare is a issue because of social attitudes as well as economic realities of people. We tend to look at ourselves as second order. Agar mere family mein male is having a health problem and I am having a health problem, I will send for treatment. And this is not necessary because my mother-in-law must be telling me. I myself feel that because it's there in my own mind. That framework is fitted in my mind. Become aware of that framework. Ask questions to yourself. So as a kind of thing, I've kind of what I felt is, as a kind of concluding thing, for this entire thing, we need to, as a culture, we do not ask questions to ourselves. We do not question. We need to develop the culture of questioning. We may not get answers, but we should never stop questioning. If I'm thinking something, if I'm thinking that मेरे भाई के और मेरे बीच में ठीक है, उसको पढ़ाई करना है, वो मर्द है, उसको लड़का है, और मैं वैसे भी घर पे ही काम करने वाली हूँ, मैं तो फैमिली देखने वाली हूँ, तो उसको पढ़ने दो. क्वेश्चन माय ओन एटीट्यूड. क्यों? क्यों? है ना? तो we suppress that, and that is one way in which we can build it in our children. And practically, as an adult, if I have a difficulty, yes, I need to look at it as a problem solving situation than an insurmountable task. So don't look up at the trekking, look down and move up.
Definitely. I think that's a really nice approach. At this point, I think I'm going to move on to the last question we have from one of the participants, which is about codependency. So the question is that can you please touch upon it and how childhood experiences can tune us automatically to become one, and how can one look to heal themselves as an adult?
See, codependency is where, meaning how I primarily will look at it as I'm defining myself in terms of you. My self definition is you. So you can imagine the amount of collusion, the amount of enmeshment that has happened. Okay, and for women, we are we are growing up in contexts where it's actually the right thing to do. Always thinking about others, not taking care of self, feeling guilty for taking care of self. These are all the social the context in which this develops. So definitely it reaches a point where it is unhealthy, meaning it's unhealthy. Being codependent is unhealthy. As I said, if I'm defining myself in terms of you, you are not there, I am not there. So one really needs to, the problems that are coming about, okay, I need to examine, is this what is happening with me? Okay, and yes, there will be hurts of the childhood. See, why do we become codependent? Because that was the way we could survive. If we did not, if we did not become codependent, then we wouldn't have survived into adulthood. So we had to adopt that pattern for survival, and it can cause a lot of, it's more of a complex, PTSD, as we would call it. Okay, so we need to approach a good helper, person who can really help us, And we need to slowly begin to develop our own self identity. Okay, develop that lens, uh, which will not come much, I feel, without external support, or which will come maybe with maybe a relationship with a teacher whom you are, very closely bonded to, or maybe your friends parents who are giving you a different view. So these are the ways in which we develop our lens. And when we develop this lens, slowly we need to emotionally empower ourselves with whatever means we can access. And that's how we slowly start uh, changing ourselves, and slowly we start talking to ourselves in a very healing manner. Like, as I said, I will not blame myself for having developed this so-called negative behavior pattern, because it was important for my survival.
Right.
So I need to acknowledge that and pat myself, care for myself, say that it's okay. It has happened with you. It's very unfortunate, but you are more than that. And slowly, one would be able to heal, experience healing. Yes, healing is very important in such situations. It is very different from talking about schizophrenia as a condition, because it's a behavior pattern here that we are talking about.
That's
So
true.
yes, healing is very essential.
Got it. So I think external help then plays an important role, and one must not hesitate to approach it.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So, ma'am, I think then we're gonna
Wind up. it's it's
now,
time. You overshot the time. I'm aware of that.
right? We do have a lot of questions, but I would just want to inform everybody that please do share them over email, and we will, reach out to Dr. Gayatri and get back
Sure.
to you with responses. Since we're running short of time, we won't be able to take it. For the closing note, since today marks the end of our over 2 month long series on women's mental health, I would request Dr. Gayatri if she could, deliver the keynote to close the session.
See, I would just like to say two things. One is, please think about mental health. Don't take it for granted. Physical health, we take care of our nutrition. We have this diet we follow this exercise regimen, we count the calories, and the moment we have some kind of physical symptom, we talk to a doctor. But mental health is also an entity. It is an entity. Okay, if you don't take care of your body will fight up to a particular limit, beyond which it goes away. Similarly, if you don't take care of your mind, it is also going to lead to unhealthy experiences. Mental life is a reality. Let's accept that. Let's not ignore it. Maybe in the last maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have a need to look at it differently, but now we have a need to look at it differently, because our social support mechanisms are changing. I am not commenting on good or bad, but they definitely are changing. We have hundreds of connections online. Okay, we are very socially connected. Ask yourself a question: are you really connected? That's important, because that's about your mental life. So talk about mental health, have conversations. That's where I congratulate Healthy Minds on having done this kind of a program, because these conversations are what are going to make us think. They are the new lens which is coming in. Okay, and develop adequate social support networks. That's very essential in these times, not only in the pandemic, but in the current times. There's so much of competition, and so much of questioning, so much of, as women, also if I look at specifically with women entering into the workforce, seeking independence, and sometimes having to fight for independence. So social mechanisms of support are very essential. So you need to actively engage to build those. They don't happen by default like it used to happen with your cousins. It doesn't happen by default. These days, you have to make an effort. Meaning, my nephew who was around 19 years of age, the other day he was talking to my mother, that is his grandmother, and said, "Okay, Party, you know what? South Indian Tambram, no? So Party means grandmother. So Party, you know what? Now I'm going to shift my home." My mother is asking, "Ari, why do you want to shift home? Itna bada ghar hai. You stay with your parents." No, 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 I don't want, because I really want my freedom. Meaning, I'm quoting it as an anecdote, but that is the reality. That is the reality, no? So, with this changing social fabric, we need to actively engage in building our social support. When we actively build our social support, I think our mental life will be populated by loving, caring relationships